Welcome to the auto industry news. The world watched in anticipation as Donald Trump, the recently elected president of the United States, took the podium and made an unprecedented announcement that rocked the auto industry. The news was unexpected, but typical of his audacious approach to governance, and it immediately sparked discussions, rumors, and a flurry of reactions from both industry experts and regular consumers. The American auto industry had been a battlefield for corporate supremacy, innovation, and regulation for decades, but nothing had prepared it for the profound change that was now put into action. What had once been a meticulously planned course for automakers was abruptly turned upside down, leaving businesses rushing to evaluate the effects. Consumers were also left wondering how this shift would affect their purchasing decisions, financial situation, and driving experiences in the years to come. The announcement focused on a significant revision of the key automotive policies that had regulated the sector for many years. This was not merely a minor adjustment to the rules that were already in place, or a gradual shift to a new framework. It was a complete upheaval that compels all market participants, manufacturers, dealerships, customers, and even overseas rivals, to completely reevaluate their business plans. The decision's main component was a broad deregulation of emissions standards, which sent a clear message to automakers both domestically and abroad. For years, strict environmental regulations had pushed manufacturers to produce hybrid and electric vehicles, forcing them to meet ever higher fuel efficiency and carbon reduction action targets. Up until now, the industry's trajectory had been clear, but with a single stroke, the regulatory pressures that had defined its future were abruptly lifted, giving automakers the freedom to pursue avenues that many had assumed were being phased. The implications were immediate and far-reaching, as traditional automakers who had been investing billions in R&D to produce electric vehicles were affected, with fewer government regulations requiring them to hasten the EV transition, EVs, and fuel economy targets now face a completely different environment. Some businesses viewed this as a chance to go back to using gasoline-powered vehicles, refocusing on internal combustion engine vehicles that had long been shares of major automakers fluctuated wildly in the hours after the announcement, reflecting the chaos in the stock market. Some businesses, especially those with significant electric vehicle investments, saw a decline in valuation as investors began to doubt the long-term viability of their plans. Others, such as the major oil and gas companies, felt more optimistic, since the expected demand for gasoline was now expected to continue to grow for a longer period of time. Outside of business boardrooms, the effects on consumers were just as complicated for people who had been on the fence about switching to electric vehicles. They may now have access to a greater range of gas-powered vehicles for years to come thanks to the policy change. Fuel prices, vehicle upkeep, and long-term dependability were once again taken into account as important factors, rather than being solely determined by government regulations. At the same time, people who had already switched to electric vehicles, whether due to economic or environmental concerns, began to question whether their investments would still be worthwhile in a future where electric dominance was not assured. International automakers also found themselves at a crossroads. Having long followed stricter environmental laws in their home countries, companies from Europe and Asia were faced with difficult choices. Would they continue to fully invest in electric technology in accordance with domestic policies? Or would they adjust to the new American environment where combustion engines were suddenly being given new life for businesses that had centered their brands around sustainability? The announcement had far-reaching effects beyond just automakers and consumers. The oil industry, which had been preparing for a steady decline in demand due to the rise of electric vehicles, found itself in a drastically different position if gasoline-powered cars were here to stay. This meant that global oil consumption would not decline as quickly as many had anticipated. The shift had implications not only for energy companies, but also for geopolitical IC relations, as oil-producing nations recalculated their strategies to align with this unexpected turn of events. In recent years, many dealerships have been making changes to their business models to accommodate the expanding market for electric vehicles, installing charging stations, retraining employees, and updating sales tactics to appeal to a clientele that is becoming more environmentally conscious. Now that deregulation is upending the market, dealers had to reconsider whether their efforts to promote electric vehicles would be as successful as they had previously believed. In the meantime, the technology sector, which had been closely entwined with the automotive industry through the development of electric vehicle batteries, charging networks, and autonomous driving systems, was forced to pause and consider its next steps. Would consumers now lean back toward traditional models given the policy shift, or would the demand for electric cars persist despite the regulatory rollback? After years of progress toward a greener automotive future that seemed inevitable due to a combination of corporate investment and policy initiatives, tech companies that had made significant investments in EV infrastructure found themselves in an uncertain position. Would automakers continue to partner with them at the same pace, or would they now look toward different opportunities that aligned with the new regulatory environment? Environmental advocacy groups responded with alarm. As expected, this abrupt reversal raised questions about the long-term effects on climate goals by threatening to slow that momentum. Advocacy groups quickly mobilized, promising to use legal challenges, public awareness campaigns, and international pressure to overturn the administration's decision. However, some industry analysts noted that Although the regulatory rollback gave the system an instant shock, it was unlikely that the long-term trajectory of the auto market would change suddenly. While some automakers would likely continue down the EV path without strict government regulations, others saw this as an opportunity for innovation. With fewer regulatory constraints, companies now had the flexibility to explore new advancements in hybrid technology, synthetic fuels, and alternative energy sources that had previously been overshadowed by the EV push. They argued that the momentum toward electric vehicles was not solely driven by government mandates, consumer preferences, technological advancements, and global trends. Despite all of these factors, it was undeniable that the American auto market had just undergone one of the most significant shifts in its history. The ripple effects would continue for years, affecting every aspect of the industry from production and sales to infrastructure and international competition. The relaxation of strict emission standards did not necessarily mean a return to outdated technologies. Rather, it simply meant that automakers had the freedom to choose their paths without the constraints of government mandates. Automakers had to make difficult decisions, because what was once thought of as a settled trajectory was now a landscape of uncertainty, opportunity, and risk. This was not just a policy change. It was a seismic event that would be discussed, examined, and dissected for years to come. One thing was certain, though. The automotive industry would never be the same, no matter what happened next. The shock waves from the announcement did not stop at the surface, and the initial reaction was full of uncertainty and speculation. A more thorough investigation showed an even more complex network of effects that would change industries. Every link in the automotive supply chain, not just automakers, was now being compelled to reevaluate its future due to the implications. That included financial institutions, city planners, suppliers of raw materials, and international trading partners. The impact on supply chains was among the most noticeable. Automakers have made large investments in rare earth minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel, which are essential components of EV batteries as a result of their aggressive sourcing and production shifts over the past 10 years to comply with stricter emission standards and the demand for electric vehicles. With the deregulation of emissions and the newfound potential, the demand for these minerals abruptly became unpredictable for mining companies and suppliers of these materials due to the resurgence of internal combustion engines. The shock was severe. New extraction sites had been invested in. Automakers and entire economies, like lithium's, had formed partnerships. These companies had to reevaluate whether their aggressive push for increased production was still justified, or whether they had overestimated the speed at which electric cars would become dominant. Rich nations had been banking on the electric vehicle industry's explosive growth. Steel producers were also affected by this change in supply chain calculations. Manufacturers of electronics and even tire companies. Manufacturers had been modifying their production lines to accommodate the specialized materials needed for lighter frames and energy-efficient components for hybrid and electric vehicles. But with the abrupt change in regulations, there was a chance that conventional internal combustion engines and heavier steel frames in more conventional cars could see a resurgent. Suppliers had to choose between continuing to serve the still expanding EV market or returning to the types of materials that had historically mainstays of conventional auto manufacturing, after years of modifying their lending and leasing models to account for the future dominance of electric vehicles. The finance sector faced a new challenge beyond supply chains. With a new degree of uncertainty introduced, auto saloon structures were constructed with the belief that EVs, despite their higher initial costs, would retain more value because of their longevity and lower maintenance requirements. Suddenly, banks and auto lenders had to recalculate the risk of whether EVs would continue to be as valuable as previously believed. These questions forced financial institutions to reevaluate their long-term strategies, potentially affecting everything from interest rates to lease structures, because they raised the question of whether traditional vehicles, which were previously predicted to decline in popularity, would suddenly experience a resurgence in demand if the shift away from gasoline-powered cars slowed down. As electric vehicles were predicted to become the new norm, the insurance sector faced its own set of difficulties, and insurers had been modifying their policies to account for their particular features. The cost of replacing a battery. Insurance companies had been planning for a world where these factors would become the norm, but the landscape was changing so quickly that they had to reconsider their pricing structures. If gas-powered vehicles continued to dominate the market for longer than anticipated, prior risk calculations would need to be modified, changing premiums and coverage models for millions of drivers. Infrastructure developers and city planners were also forced to reevaluate their plans. In anticipation of a swift shift away from gasoline-powered vehicles, numerous urban areas had already made significant investments in infrastructure for electric vehicle charging. In order to handle the anticipated surge of battery-powered vehicles, public funds had been set aside for the expansion of EV charging networks. parking structure retrofits, and traffic pattern redesigns. Now that these investments were being questioned, would cities need to reevaluate their priorities in order to balance traditional refueling requirements with EV-friendly initiatives? While gas station operators who had been considering whether to switch to alternative fuels suddenly found themselves wondering whether it was too early to make that shift internationally, real estate markets also felt the effects of Trump's announcement. Developers who had incorporated EV-friendly designs into new buildings, such as installing charging stations in residential complexes, were now wondering whether those investments would yield the expected return. China and the European Union, who had both been actively promoting electric vehicles through stringent laws and government subsidies, now had to decide whether to continue on their current trajectory, assuming that America's change was merely a short-term political ploy, or to modify their tactics to compete in a world where the US was no longer supporting the global push for electrification. For China in particular, the decision was crucial. The US market had been viewed as a key battleground for Chinese EV makers looking to expand internationally. But with a change in US policy, those plans faced uncertainty. Would American consumers still gravitate toward Chinese-made EVs, or would they return to buying traditional cars from domestic manufacturers? The country had been positioning itself as the dominant force in electric vehicle production, with government incentives fueling the rise of massive battery manufacturers and automakers specializing in EV technology. European automakers also had to make difficult choices. Businesses like Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Volkswagen had already made significant investments in electrification, and their business plans were predicated on the idea that EVs would soon rule important international markets, including the US. Trump's deregulation initiatives presented a dilemma for these automakers. Should they continue their aggressive electrification strategies, or modify their products to better compete in a US market where gasoline-powered vehicles were no longer subject to as many restrictions? Agreements on trade, global economic strategies, and supply chains were examined. Countries that had staked their long-term energy and trade policies on a smooth transition to electric vehicles began to wonder if they needed to hedge their bets. With all of these industrial and economic changes, the United States, which was once seen as a major player in the global movement for sustainable transportation, is now an outlier, raising concerns about how trade agreements and international partnerships will be modified. The future of the American people was shaped by both cultural and societal responses, which resulted in division. Deregulation was greeted by some as a return to freedom of choice. Others viewed letting customers determine the market's course, instead of imposing regulations, as a step backward that would undermine the gains made in halting climate change and lowering fossil fuel-dependent car enthusiasts and performance-focused buyers viewed this as a victory because many had been complaining about the slow demise of V8 engines, manual gearboxes, and classic muscle cars as automakers shifted to electrification, and less regulation forced businesses to reduce emissions and fuel consumption. Performance-oriented automobiles may experience a comeback with producers once more able to put engine-driven experience and power ahead of environmental restrictions. Environmental activists, on the other hand, saw the announcement as a catastrophe. Many had spent years calling for cleaner air, stricter emission standards, and a gradual transition away from fossil fuels. Now, with a single policy change, much of that progress was at risk. Protests, lobbying, and grassroots movements came together to oppose the deregulation, promising to fight back against what they saw as a regressive step that could have disastrous effects on future generations. Public opinion of automakers also became a significant factor. The way businesses position themselves in this new reality could make or break their long-term success. At the core of it all was the one undeniable truth. The car market had entered a period of unprecedented uncertainty. Automakers faced existential questions about their business strategies. Would brands like Tesla that had built their reputation on sustainability continue to thrive in an America that was no longer actively pushed toward EVs? Or would traditional car manufacturers that produced gasoline-powered trucks and SUVs benefit from a resurgence in demand? Consumers found themselves in the middle of a rapidly changing landscape, where the future of transportation was less clear than it had once seemed. The world was closely watching to see which direction the market would take. Would this deregulation usher in a new era of gasoline-powered dominance, or would the momentum for electric vehicles continue despite the policy shift? Would automakers use the relaxed regulations to revive older technologies? Or would they continue innovating, realizing that the global market outside of the US was still moving towards sustainability? Though the immediate effects of Donald Trump's policy shift sent shockwaves through the automotive sector, the long-term ramifications were far more complex and deeply woven into the fabric of global economics, technology, and societal trends. Regardless of the outcome, one thing was certain. The shockwaves set in motion by Trump's shocking announcement would be felt for years to come. changing the landscape of the automobile industry in ways no one could have predicted. The core characteristics of the auto industry were now changing, with major players re-evaluating everything from global investments to government lobbying to production plans and marketing campaigns. The industry was venturing into uncharted territory, and the future was far from certain. The impact on corporate strategy was one of the most important aspects of this change. In the years preceding Trump's decision, the biggest automakers made significant investments in alternative fuels and electric cars, not only to meet regulations but also to stay relevant in a market that was becoming more conscientious and had fewer restrictions from the government. For businesses that had invested billions of dollars in electric vehicle technology, the question was whether automakers would stick with their EV plans or switch to less costly gas-powered production. It wasn't an easy choice for it. There was a strong economic case for accepting deregulation of the production of internal combustion engine vehicles. But General Motors, Toyota, and Volkswagen had all set ambitious electrification targets and had committed enormous resources to battery research, supply chain development, and factory conversions. Reversing those investments could mean wasting billions of dollars already spent on infrastructure. Not to mention losing ground to competitors who remained focused on electric mobility was substantially less expensive than producing electric vehicles. And since there were no strict emission regulations requiring the switch, some businesses saw a chance to recover short-term profit margins on gasoline-powered trucks and SUVs, which had previously been among the most lucrative market segments, could now be preserved rather than phased out. Automakers faced a unique dilemma as a result of freedom. On the one hand, they could use deregulation as an excuse to keep making conventional vehicles in order to appease shareholders who wanted quick returns. But on the other hand, they ran the risk of lagging behind in the global movement towards sustainability, since other markets, like the European Union and China, were still making rapid progress toward electric mobility. Other world powers had been carefully adjusting their economic policies around a gradual shift toward electric vehicles, so America's abrupt policy change forced governments to re-evaluate their own strategies. Trump's shocking decision had immediate geopolitical ramifications, in addition to its impact on the US market. For instance, China used significant government subsidies to establish itself as the world leader in EV production for years. Aggressive acquisitions of rare earth mineral supplies and significant factory expansions. In the meantime, the European Union found itself in a precarious position as Chinese automakers were poised to dominate the global electric vehicle race. The US's decision to withdraw from its commitment to EVs disrupted that trajectory, but some in Beijing saw this as an opportunity. If American manufacturers slowed their adoption of EVs, Chinese automakers like BYD and G could expand their presence in other markets uncontested. With America no longer following that course, European automakers that sold vehicles worldwide faced a split market. Should they continue to produce primarily electric models to comply with EU regulations, or should they maintain a parallel production line for gas-powered vehicles aimed at American consumers? EU nations had long imposed stricter fuel efficiency standards than the US, setting clear deadlines for banning internal combustion engines. The response to this query had far-reaching implications for businesses such as BMW. In the meantime, oil-producing nations, especially those in the Middle East, faced an unexpected shift in global energy demand as the world moved toward electrification. Many OPEC nations had been preparing for a future in which oil revenues would slowly decline. But with Trump's policies signaling an extended reliance on gasoline-powered vehicles in the US, those long-term strategies needed to be re-evaluated. Mercedes-Benz and Renault maintaining two separate production lines would increase costs, while choosing just one path could risk losing a significant portion of the global market. Russia, a significant oil exporter, was also assessing the effects of this change because its economic stability was directly linked to the demand for petroleum worldwide. If America's deregulation resulted in a prolonged reliance on gasoline-powered vehicles, it could boost Russia's energy sector in ways that few had predicted beyond the effects on the economy and industry. According to many conservatives and libertarians, Trump's announcement had a significant cultural impact on American society. The debate over climate change regulation and government intervention had long been a contentious issue in the US, and the auto industry was now at the center of that battle. They saw deregulation as a victory for personal freedom, allowing consumers to choose the cars they want to drive without being forced to do so by government mandates, while others saw the rollback of emission standards as a necessary correction to what they perceived as excessive governmental overreach. Environmentalists and progressive lawmakers saw the decision as a catastrophic setback. Years of progress toward reducing carbon emissions, improving air quality and combating climate change were now in jeopardy. Climate activists mobilized quickly, calling for boycotts of companies that took advantage of the deregulation. Some states particularly California began exploring legal challenges aiming to maintain their own stricter emission standards independent of federal policy. This created a unique scenario where individual states and municipalities had to decide whether to follow federal deregulation or maintain their own more stringent rules. If states like California continued enforcing strict emissions laws, it could create a fractured auto market, where different regions of the US had vastly different vehicle requirements. Despite the deregulation, technological advancement in the auto industry was unlikely to slow down completely, while government mandates had certainly driven much of the push toward electric vehicles. Consumer interest and competition in the private sector continued to have a big impact on automotive trends. For example, Tesla's whole brand was centered on independence from conventional automakers, sustainability, and technological innovation. While legacy automakers hesitated, startups in the EV and battery sectors faced a different challenge. Many of them had relied on government incentives and emissions regulations to attract investment. But with those policies now reversed, venture capitalists and institutional investors might be less willing to fund their projects, which could lead to a consolidation of the electric vehicle industry. Elon Musk's company had already disrupted the auto industry by demonstrating that electric vehicles could be desirable, high performance, and profitable. Even with Trump's deregulation, Tesla was unlikely to abandon its mission. Instead, it could capitalize on this moment by solidifying its dominance in the EV space. In contrast to a market where only the most powerful and established companies survived, traditional automakers now had greater latitude to investigate alternative technologies that had been marginalized in the drive for electrification. For instance, hydrogen fuel cells have long been seen as a viable substitute for battery-powered EVs, but their use has been hindered by stringent emissions regulations that prefer electric vehicles with fewer restrictions. With all of these factors at play, one thing remained clear. The auto industry was entering one of the most unpredictable periods in its history. Trump's deregulation was not just a temporary policy change. It was a fundamental shift in the trajectory of one of the most important industries in the world. Companies may look again at hydrogen as a viable path. Similarly, synthetic fuels and biofuels, which were once thought of as niche markets, may attract renewed interest. These fuels offer a potential middle ground between gasoline and full electrification. For decades, the auto industry's future would be determined by how automakers responded. Regardless of the result, would they welcome the deregulation as an opportunity to maintain the dominance of internal combustion engines, or would they press ahead with electrification in spite of the absence of government pressure? Would international markets adjust to reflect America's new policies, or would the US stand out in the shift to sustainable transportation? The world was watching industries recalibrate, and the future of the automobile, which was once thought to be on a predictable path, was now more uncertain than ever beyond the automotive industry itself. The announcement had already changed the landscape in ways that could not be reversed. The technology sector, for example, had been preparing for an electric vehicle revolution that would drive demand for advanced software, artificial intelligence, and autonomous driving capabilities. Companies that specialized in electric vehicle charging networks, battery recycling, and AI-driven vehicle systems had counted on a steady increase in EV adoption. Now that trajectory has been thrown into uncertainty, many of these firms found themselves in limbo, unsure whether their projected growth rates were still realistic. Trump's deregulation had an unexpected ripple effect on other sectors that were not directly related to the production of vehicles, but were closely linked to its evolution.